my loves, and welcome to this episode of the Fluffenhammer Adjacent, in which we're going to be taking a look at one of my favourite creations from Games Workshop, one of my favourite units in Warhammer 40,000, but also one of my favourite pieces of background in the entire mythology. We're going to be having a look at the Plague Marines. Now, the Plague Marines are, in many respects, they are, for me, emblematic of what Warhammer 40,000 is. Warhammer 40,000 is this massively satirical universe where everything is so ridiculously extreme, where everything is so dystopian and grimdark that you cannot help, if you have any literary sensibility or mythological sensibility at all, you cannot help but see the satire in it. I mean, we know from interviews with the likes of Ian Livingstone, Rick Priestley, the people who basically created Warhammer 40,000, that it was originally intended as this incredible satire of the politics of the era, which in the UK would be the 1980s, it would be the early decades of neoliberalism, Thatcherism, the rise of right-wing politics, etc., etc. That's what Warhammer 40,000 represents. It is this kind of ideological playing field where everything is extrapolated to such an extreme degree that one cannot help but take it as satire. And the Death Guard, the Plague Marines, they exemplify that to the nth degree for me, because like even the I won't even use the term good guys, because there are no good guys in Warhammer 40,000. There are literally none. Even those who advertise themselves as the ultimate good guys, which I suppose would be the Tau in many respects, are inherently dystopian. There is something fundamentally misconceived about them, or deceitful, or Orwellian in the way they go about things. The only way to create bad guys, if you like, or antagonistic characters or forces that can in any way be regarded as such in comparison to the good guys, i.e. the likes of the Space Marines. And the Space Marines are at base level, at conception, genetically engineered Ubermensch. They are super Nazis. And these are the good guys, right? These are the good guys of the universe. They're the more positive forces of the universe. They are super Nazis. Even your most civilized Space Marine Legion, which would be either the Ultramarines or maybe the Salamanders, even the most humane of them, have committed genocides and atrocities and suppressions, the like of which make real-world despotisms and totalitarian movements look like schoolyard gangs. They are the worst of the worst of the worst, or they would be in any other universe. It's just that in this universe, there are worse things. And the Plague Marines kind of represent that. In order to create antagonistic characters or forces, what they've had to do is go into like metaphysical elemental evil or negativity, and that's what the forces of chaos represent. I mean, the part of the irony is, although aesthetically the likes of the Plague Marines might seem to obviously be evil or negative, when you actually dive into their background, it's not that simple. It just isn't that simple. Like most things in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, what they represent is a conflicting ideology, a conflicting perspective, and one that in its own way is no worse or better than what the Imperium provides or represents or imposes upon its citizens, right? If you're born as a normal human being into practically any imperial civilization, any world or culture that comes under imperial purview, you are condemned. You are condemned to the most horrific state of servitude and slavery. The best you can hope for is that you will actually be allowed to die quickly and cleanly, which is unlikely. Most likely your flesh, even your mind might be taken and used posthumously. You might be turned into a servitor, for example, or wired into one of the many systems or machines that pervade imperial society and that maintain its bureaucratic functions. There's nothing good here. There is no hope here. The Plague Marines just represent a differing ideology in that regard. It's extreme, that's absolutely true, but everything in the Warhammer 40,000 universe is extreme. There is really nowhere you can go. There is nowhere you can go where there is a clear-cut, better or positive way of being in this universe. Everything is dark, everything is compromised, everything is varying shades of malevolence and inhumanity. What the Plague Marines are, they are sumptuously grotesque. They the man, anyone who's ever read the descriptions of the Plague Marines in the various different books, the codices and whatnot, or has seen the artwork of them, which is lovingly rendered, basically the creators, the writers, the artists have just gone full out in creating the most disgusting, depraved, repulsive body horror they can possibly conceive of. The Plague Marines are basically space marines, so these genetically engineered Ubermensch characters who have dedicated themselves to one of the Chaos powers, the Chaos god Nurgle, who is the elemental manifestation of despair, of decay, of disease, of corruption. But he himself, he also represents a certain irony. He is not... Many of his followers actually are despairing and diseased, and many of the Plague Marines are too, but not all of them. Nurgle himself has this really ironic joviality about him. He's actually very sentimental because he represents a certain myopia as well, a certain emotional myopia, of which tradition and sentiment are part and parcel. So he actually is very happy with his diseased condition, and in fact sees it as beautiful and truthful, and finds the struggles of the mortal races in the universe kind of funny because it's so futile. It's so futile. He actually regards them as children, as naive children, and his actions in the material universe are those of a guiding paternalistic figure, of a father, and that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to guide his followers, and even just anyone who comes under his purview, which is practically everyone, because everyone at some point suffers despair or disease, right? He's trying to guide them to a more truthful or better way of being, which under his auspices is embracing your despair. It's embracing futility and surrendering to it. That's what he represents, fundamental surrender. And that's what the Death Guard are. That's what the Plague Marines are. They're space marines who have been infected with a particular disease, which is the Destroyer Plague. And the Destroyer Plague is one of the finest of Nurgle's creations. It's one of his favourite creations. It basically manifests the symptoms of every disease known to man. Every infection, every virus, every bacteria, every cancer known to man. But it doesn't allow those it infects to die. In fact, it sustains them. It's a metaphysical disease as well. It sustains them in that state of suffering until their minds break, until they can't take it anymore. And that's what happened to the Death Guard Legion of Space Marines. And that's where the original Plague Marines came from. Initially, they were broken by despair, and they couldn't stand their diseased conditions. But over time, that has changed. Some of them are still the same. Some of them still, after 10,000 years of enduring in this condition, still lament their conditions, and they seek to bring down the rest of the universe down to their level so that it doesn't seem as shameful or as hideous as they perceive themselves to be. But the vast majority of them, they've had their minds warped to the same degree as their bodies. This is part of Nurgle's gift. When he initially afflicts his victims, who will become his servants eventually, they might rail against him, they might lament it, but as they suffer and as their sanity slowly dissolves and as their minds warp, he actively warps their perspectives so that they start to perceive their conditions as truthful, as emblematic of something that cannot be denied. And eventually, they start to see it as true and beautiful and as desirable. And so, when they are spreading Nurgle's plagues and diseases and afflictions across the universe, they do it in a jovial and giving manner. They're actually gregarious, and they are happy to be doing what they're doing. They are the givers of gifts. They're actually enlightening the rest of the universe by sowing despair and disease and plague and pandemics. It's so hideous and brilliant. Beyond that, you've got the incredible extremity at which they operate, which is so unfathomable and so far almost beyond imagination. These entities, they walk in a state of constant disease, but not in agony. That's another thing about Nurgle's gift. It warps perception such that they start to perceive their decaying and diseased forms as pleasurable. They actually take pleasure in the disgrace of it, and in the pain becomes something else. It becomes something to be enjoyed. The symptoms of disease become something to enjoy. There's something so repulsively brilliant about that. I cannot help but be attracted to it on a mythological level. Part of what makes the Plague Marines so interesting for me, their aesthetics, the body horror of them is so extreme and so disgusting and so wonderful, and the writers and artists who portray them really go to town on it. They just go Lovecraftian with over description, because that's what suits them, that's what makes them work, that's why they're so attractive. And you'll find that Nurgle's followers, the Plague Marines, the Death Guard, the Maggotkin in Age of Sigmar, they are some of the most popular armies out there. People go nuts for these guys. Nurgle has become one of the most popular Chaos powers because he's so distinct, he's so extreme. There's so much you can do with it in terms of hobby, in terms of sculpting, painting, even writing work. I mean, the writers who have tried to capture what it's like to be a Plague Marine, that's some of my favourite shit in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. I've got to say, that is just the stuff for me. Because how do you capture that psychologically? How do you capture the experience of being that and experiencing that every single moment of your waking existence? Chris Wright, the writer Chris Wright, tried it in The Lords of Silence and did it rather successfully, I have to say. The Lords of Silence is one of the few novels that really goes to town on that very element. It tries to explore what the psychology of these creatures is like, to operate as something that any sane human being would perceive as horrific, as repulsive, but to capture the sincere joy and celebration that these creatures feel at their own disgraceful and disgusting conditions. That's incredible. And also, one thing Chris Wright does, which I absolutely love, he looks into like the neurological effects of the diseases they suffer. So they have this wonderful element where they're not sure about many, many things. They have these lapses where their diseased and rotting minds fall out of reality, basically, where they will wake up and they're in a different place, or their perceptions have changed, or time has been lost, or their perceptions have been warped. It is absolutely wonderful. They are horror. The Plague Marines are a sublime and brilliant form of horror that I absolutely love, because it's a similar form of horror and attraction that the Cenobites exercise. The Cenobites in Hellraiser, in Clive Barker's Hellraiser and the Hellbound Heart and various different comic offshoots, they ostensibly seem to be repulsive and horrific, and yet they exercise a peculiar fascination and even a bizarre kind of ideological attraction, a mythological attraction, because they operate at this extreme state, which is nevertheless attractive in its own peculiar way. I suppose in terms of its purity, in terms of its poetry and purity, the Plague Marines emphasize something very similar. They might be ostensibly disgusting and filthy and disgraceful, but they also have a certain purity and poetry. They have a purpose. They are following the dictates of a particular mythology, and indeed the purposes of a genuinely divine power, that is Nurgle, an actual god. Insofar as gods mean anything in this universe, Nurgle is one of them. Nurgle is a sincere god in the metaphysics of this universe. And they represent what can become if one dedicates oneself to these powers. The greatest amongst them, of course, the champions and the Chaos Lords, and those who experience the greatest of Nurgle's gifts actually benefit from them enormously and have their minds warped to such a degree that they celebrate and absolutely adore their conditions to the nth degree. And you can see how there might be something attractive in that. I think that's the true horror that the Plague Marines represent, to be honest. It's the fact that you can understand why someone would fall to the conscious worship of Nurgle, even though it might seem to be insanity on the face of it. And in that, the Plague Marines represent one of the most complex psychologies in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Beyond what they represent ideologically, they are fascinatingly perverse and extreme, and there's something in me that the horror fan in me just cannot help but be attracted by that. It's why the Death Guard are easily one of my favorite armies in 40k. You cannot really get away from how grotesque and extreme they are. There is something that draws people to them because aesthetically alone, I mean, the armies are so interesting, they're so distinct, they offer such a wealth of conversion material for players. You can do so much with them, and people have. If you go and search for like Plague Marine or Death Guard conversions out there, holy hell, the modeling opportunities that people have taken with these things is unbelievable. They also have, I mean, if you just want to look at it in hobby terms, they have one of the most complete and best miniatures ranges out there. The Death Guard have a beautiful miniatures range, and I would argue that the current miniatures range is probably the best they've ever been. I know that there are differences of opinion on that, because some players prefer a more subtle approach to them, such as could be found in, say, the second ed range of Death Guard miniatures, which was much more suggestive of what was underneath the armour. But for me, I really like that elaborate, over-the-top, almost confusing sculpting they've got going on, because I think that suits their character. For my personal aesthetics, with regards to Chaos and Nurgle, that really does it for me. And I absolutely love them. The Plague Marines are one of my favourite units in 40k, and I remember being attracted to them from the off. I remember getting my second ed Chaos Space Marine Codex when I was a kid, which was one of the first I ever read alongside the old Eldar Codex, and the artwork of the Plague Marines in that book is just beautiful, as are the descriptions of what they are and how they operate and what they do. It's sumptuous. It is absolutely beautiful. And I remember, like, one of my first Chaos forces was actually a Death Guard force, and I've dabbled with them in and out for years. I had a Death Guard force in 3rd ed in 3.5 that was led by Typhus. I've dived in and out of the Death Guard ever since, and I've just almost finished painting one of the new Death Guard miniatures, and it's beautiful, and it's made me think, ooh, I could get back into these, although, I am currently more immersed in Slaanesh and the Hedonites and Zeech and the Thousand Sons. I could really get back into these guys in a big way. One thing I'm definitely going to do is paint up Mortarion at some point, because he is everything about the Death Guard and about Nurgle that I adore is encapsulated in that miniature. Mortarion is one of the best miniatures they've ever done. I mean, he is absolutely beautiful. There are very few miniatures that capture the essential ethos of the character they're trying to portray in the same way that miniature does. It is sublime, and sublimely disgusting, which is a very, very good description of Nurgle and his followers in general. So yeah, the Plague Marines, one of the most disgusting, brilliant conceptions in all of Warhammer 40,000, and just a surefire hit, one of the most consistent favourites.